Hey folks, when you're working on a website, it is really important to make sure that your files and folders are organized. For one thing, knowing where everything is will make it a lot easier to find what you're looking for when you're developing the project. And even after the website is done, if you or another developer has to go back weeks or even months later, you really don't want to waste your time searching through spaghetti code or a million files that are in your project root. Also, if you're trying to get a job as a web developer, having a nicely organized codebase can really help you stand out from the crowd. I've heard from multiple people over the years that they were actually able to land a job in the industry, thanks in part to my videos teaching them how to name things and set up their styles. So I wanted to make a video today showing you how I set up my Sass styles in projects. I'll show you how I split things up into subfolders and Sass partials, utilize Sass functions and mixins, and take a quick look at how I use the BEM or block element modifier approach in class names. So if you want to have organized Sass styles that'll make your portfolio project something to be proud of, I'll be sharing all my tips in this video. Sound good? Let's get into it. Alright, so to start, in VS Code, I've made this boilerplate Sass project. In the project root, I just have an index.html file, which has all of the HTML markup. Then I have an image folder, which has an image of a cat. And then I have a SCSS folder, which contains all of our Sass styles. So I'm going to walk you through all of the Sass files that I have in this boilerplate project and show you how everything works together. You can use this project for yourself and then expand and build off of it for your own projects. The source code for this is on my GitHub, which is linked below. And if you aren't familiar with Sass, I do have an intro to Sass video on my channel, which I've linked up here somewhere as well. All right, let's take a look at our styles. So in the SCSS folder, I have a main style.scss file. And if we open this up, we can see that it is using a Sass @rule use to load global and components. So what's happening here is that, for example, if we look at the use global rule, Sass is going to look for a file or a subfolder called global. And we do have a subfolder called global, which you can see here. And if we expand it, it contains multiple SCSS files. Now, the most important one that we want to look at right now is the index.scss file. And if we open this, you can see that it is forwarding all the other Sass files in this folder. So when we're using global in our main style.scss file, Sass is going to go to the global folder and then look for an index.scss file and then load all the Sass partials that are listed here. Now, one quick note about file names. Most of the Sass files have underscores at the beginning of their file name, which you can see here. And what this does is it tells Sass when it's compiling that these are Sass partial files and they should not be compiled into their own individual CSS file. Now in the project root, our main style.scss file does not have an underscore. So when we compile, Sass is going to create the final CSS file based on what's in the style.scss file. And then everything compiles to a final CSS file with the same name, which is style.css. Now, if you didn't use underscores in your Sass partial file names, each of them would be compiled to a separate CSS file with the same name, for example, boilerplate.css, colors.css, and so on, which is not what we want. We really just want that one final style.css file. So if we take a look at the SCSS folder again, we have the global folder, which contains global styles that are used throughout the website. Then we have a components folder, which contains styles specific to sections of the website, like the header, the footer, and the hero section. And the components folder, just like the globals folder, has its own index.scss file that forwards the other Sass partials in that folder. And there's also a util folder. And you may have noticed that we didn't load the util styles in our main style.scss file. So the reason for this is that the Sass partials in the util folder don't contain actual style rules. Now, just for comparison, if we look at the global subfolder and look at the boilerplate.scss file, you can see that we have what looks like regular CSS style rules with selectors and the rules. However, if we look at the Sass partials in the util folder, these only contain Sass features. For example, in the functions.scss file, it has two functions. We have a rem function, which converts pixels to rems, And then we have an EM function that does the same thing, except it converts to EMs. And we have a Mixins Sass file, and this one contains one mixin that I use to generate fluid typography for font size using the clamp function. And then if we go down below that, I also have some mixins that I use to generate media queries. So because all of these util Sass styles aren't actual style rules, we don't need to load them in our main style.scss file. I am going to go into a little bit more detail later on about how these mixins and functions work, so you'll understand how to use them in your own projects. So in a nutshell, that's how we're using the util Sass features. And this is the approach that I think makes the most sense to me, to separate them from the regular style rules. But I have seen other people mix them together in the same Sass partial, which is fine too. Just make sure that anything that does have actual style rules gets loaded in your main Sass file. All right, now let's take a bit of a closer look at our global styles. And let's start with the boilerplate.scss file. So here I have style rules that I use in pretty much every project to reset styles, meaning getting rid of some browser default styles that we don't want, and to also set some default styles that I always want to apply for specific tags. So this first one sets box sizing border box on every element using the wildcard, and that is something that you want on pretty much every website because it will ensure that the final size of an element will take padding into account instead of adding padding in addition to the width or the height. Then on the body tag, I'm resetting the margins to 0 and then adding the font family, background, and color properties. And then the image tag, I am setting them to be display block instead of their default display inline, which gets rid of a tiny little space that the browser will add at the bottom of inline elements, which you don't want for images. And then setting a max width of 100% so that the images will not get larger than their container and cause horizontal scrolling if they're really big. Now there are a lot more reset styles that you can add here if you want. If you're curious, I would recommend checking out Josh Como or Andy Bell's CSS resets, which I have linked down in the description. All right, so next in our global styles is the colors.scss file. Now you can set colors as Sass variables, but I've just started using CSS custom properties for all my variables nowadays because the browser can read CSS custom props, which does make it a bit nicer when you're inspecting things in the DevTools. And you can change CSS custom properties on the fly using JavaScript. So overall, I think they're just a little more versatile and more powerful than Sass variables. Now with the colors, I am setting them on the root element up here, as you can see. And this makes them kind of like global variables because you can use them anywhere in the website. And in addition to global CSS custom properties, you can also set local CSS custom properties within a selector like a class, so that way they can only be used by elements or child elements of that element class. Now for naming these CSS custom properties, you might notice that I'm prefixing all of these with the word color. And that kind of just tells you that you know exactly what the CSS custom property is for. It's to save a color. Now for color format, I do really like using HSL right now. HSL stands for hue, saturation, lightness, and I like it because it makes it a lot easier to adjust a color's lightness or darkness and even the saturation, and it's just easier than working with hex codes. For example, I made the background color this very dark sort of blue-purple color, and then below it, I added a header background color, which is the same hue as we have in the background, but it is a little bit lighter because the lightness is 20% instead of 11%. And I did kind of the same thing with the accent color, which is a magenta down here. And then below that is a highlight color, which is also magenta, but it's just a bit darker. So if you look at the website, you can see if we're inspecting the body that we have our background colors down here. You can see them as the CSS custom props. If you hover over them, Firefox will tell you the HSL value. And if you scroll down a little, you can see that all the colors are inherited from the HTML element or the root, and you can see them all listed here. All right, so that's how I set up my colors. So next, let's look at the decoration.scss file. So here I have styles that add some stylistic effects to different elements. The first one is a helper or utility class called rounded, and this adds a border radius to an element to round the corners. And if we go to the website and we inspect the image, we can see that it has rounded corners, and they are coming from that rounded helper class with the border radius property. And then I've also added a style for the EM or emphasis tag, and this adds a highlight background color to text that is inside the EM tag. And you can see that on the website in this paragraph down here. It has the EM tag. So these are just a couple examples of decorative styles you can add to your project. You can expand on this and add any other decorative types of styles that can be used, anywhere in the website. For example, you could add a background image with an SVG pattern, or you could add a linear gradient background to some text. All right, let's move on and look at the next file, which is the layout.scss file. So here, the main thing that's going on is that I have this wrapper class, and it's limiting the width to 1110 pixels using the rem function here, or 100% of the width minus 40 pixels, which ends up being 20 pixels on either side because we are centering the wrapper using margin inline auto. Wrapper styles are a pretty important part of building website UIs, so if this looks kind of confusing to you, and I admit it can look confusing if you're not used to it, I do actually have a whole video just on wrapper styles that explains this style rule and more, and you might find that helpful, so I will be linking that somewhere up here. All right, and then nested inside the wrapper class, I also have an additional helper class called has padding. And what this does is it's adding padding block, meaning on the top and bottom, 40 pixels for our mobile default styles. And then I'm using the breakpoint mixin to add a media query to add a padding block of 60% for larger viewports. Now, in this file, the mixin is not here. And we're able to use this breakpoint mixin, even though it doesn't exist in this specific style, because we've made it accessible by adding this use at rule up at the top. As you can see here, we're writing the path to the util folder, and then we're also setting a custom namespace of the letter U when we write the as U section of the rule. So this means that when we're loading a mixin or function from the util folder, we have to prefix whatever that mixin or function is with the namespace of U and dot. And you can see that's what we're doing in the actual breakpoint here. We're saying include the mixin U dot breakpoint. And we're doing the same thing up at the top with the U rem function here. Now, if we didn't explicitly set a custom namespace like we did here with as U, it would take the name of the folder. So we would have to type out util.rem 1100 and util.breakpoint. And it's just a little bit longer, so that's why I like adding these custom namespaces with just the letter. Now let's trace back and see what's happening with this breakpoint mixin. So if we go to the util folder and we open the mixins.scss file, we have the breakpoint mixin here, and it takes a parameter called size. And then in the curly brackets, the mixin is going to generate code for a media query. You can see at media, and then in parentheses it says width greater than or equal to, and then it says map get, which is another function from Sass. So this map get function works with Sass maps. Sass maps are objects that contain key value pairs, and map get is a function that you can use to return a value from the map based on the key that you want. So in our mixins file, we do have a Sass map right above the actual mixins called breakpoints, and it contains two pairs. One has a key called medium, and the value is 700 pixels converted to EMs using our EM function. Then we have another pair called large as the key, and the value for that is 1200 pixels, again converted to EMs. And let's go back one step further and see where this EM function came from. So we're loading it here with a letter F namespace, and all the way up at the top, you can see that we're using the functions.scss file with that F namespace. Now we have to explicitly load the functions file here in the Mixins Sass file because we can't load the whole util folder in a Sass partial that's already in the util folder, because you can see here on the left sidebar in the util folder we have the Mixins and the functions Sass partials both here. So if we tried loading the util folder in the Mixins file like we did in the layout Sass partial, we would create a module loop because it's trying to load itself in itself, and that would cause an error. So that's why we're loading just the functions.scss file in our Mixins file. So let's take a look at that functions.scss file. So both the rem and em functions take a pixel number as a parameter, and then they divide by 16 to get the number. And then in the rem function, we're multiplying the result by 1 rem, and that is in order to add the rem unit to the final number. And then the em function is similar, except it's multiplying it by 1 em in order to add the em unit to the number. So going back to the Mixins, that's how we get the 700 and the 1200 pixels converted to em units. And I do like using ems in my media queries. You can use rems too. They both behave basically the same way. So now that we know what Sass maps are doing, let's go back to our breakpoint mixin. So in the breakpoint mixin, it starts generating code for the media query. So, width greater than or equal to, and then we're using that map get function to read the breakpoints map, which you can see here in the first parameter. That's the name of the Sass map you want to read from. And then the second parameter is the key that you want to look up and get the value back from. So when we see where this mixin was actually used in our layout styles, we said U breakpoint, and then the parameter was medium. So medium is a key we're looking for from that Sass map. So going back to the mixins.scss file, the size is medium, and you can see here, medium will give you a value of 700 pixels. So this is going to make the full media query be at media width greater than or equal to 700 pixels, and of course that's converted to EMs. And then below that, in the curly brackets, the at content rule is going to load whatever style rule content we added when we wrote that mixin in our layout styles. So in our case, that would be the style rule padding block of 60 pixels. So that kind of explains what the mixin does. Let's see the final output for this breakpoint mixin that we used in our layout styles. So if I fold these all up, we're compiling our Sass styles to a final style.css file, which is in the SCSS folder. So if we open that, and let's do a search for has padding, and you can see in our CSS styles, we have the selector of wrapper class plus has padding class, and it has a padding block of 40 pixels. And then below that, we have our media query. So we have the media query with a width of greater than or equal to 43.75 EMs, which is 700 pixels. And then inside that, we have, again, the wrapper has padding classes, and then padding block is changed and is now 60 pixels. And all of this media query is coming from loading our breakpoint mixin in our layout styles. All right, so those are the layout styles that I have here. Other style that you could add here would be, helper classes that maybe create a grid or flexbox parent with some default gap space and maybe even alignment. You could also add styles for elements that you want to be positioned absolute and centered. So anything that relates to sizing or positioning elements on the page could go in this layout.scss file. All right, now addition into the helper classes, like what we're using here with the has padding class, I did want to show you another approach that I use when I'm writing styles, which is the BEM or block element modifier approach, which is used a lot when you're using Sass. So let's take a look at the component styles now. So like I mentioned earlier, for components, I usually put in section-specific styles. I have Sass partials for the footer, header, and hero sections. Now let's take a look at the header styles first. But let's start with the markup in the index.html file so you can see how I come up with class names. All right, so in the HTML, the header is the header tag, and then all the elements inside the header tag also. So in the header tag, we have a nav or navigation tag, which is the proper semantic tag that you should use for navigation links. And then in the nav tag, we have an unordered list containing list items for each of the navigation links. And again, it is considered best practice to put lists of links in list tags because it makes it easier for you to parse what kind of content you have on the website, and it's also better for screen readers to know what kind of content is on the page. All right, so let's take a look at the class names of the header elements. The BEM approach that I'm using is why you're seeing long class names for some of these elements, and also why some of them have an underscore. BEM is one way to make sure that all the class names throughout your website are unique, because if you accidentally name two different elements with the same class name, it's going to cause some weird conflicts and it's going to apply styles that you probably don't want to. Now with BEM, you start with the block, and this is what you can think of as the component, meaning the specific section of the website that you're writing styles for. So in this case, the header is a component, and so I've given the header tag a class of header to act as the block, because BEM utilizes a lot of different class names in the selectors. And I'm also using that block name of header in the actual file name of the Sass parcel, header.scss. Using the same name for all of these different places helps tell you that these styles are all part of the same header section of the website. So the block is the parent, and it contains child elements, which are the elements in the BEM model. So for example, the unordered list tag is a BEM element, and it has a class name of header __ items. The elements are going to have their class names start with the block name, header, and then followed by two underscores, and then the element name, which for the UL tag is items. And I am using the plural form of items for the unordered list tag because the UL tag contains multiple children of list items. So in the same way, the list items themselves have a class of header item, singular, so that you know that the class name is for each individual list item. And then inside each list item, we have an anchor link, which has a class of header __ link. So again, prefixing all of these class names with header helps keep them unique from anything else on the website, and also tells us which part of the website these elements are in. All right, so that's the HTML. Now let's take a look at the header.scss styles. So in our header.scss file, we have the BEM block, which is the header class, and then nested inside it, we have some styles, we have a breakpoint mixin, and then we have the child items. And these are the child BEM elements. So header __ items, header __ item, and then header __ link. And these are all the elements that we just were looking at in our HTML. So nesting is actually one of my favorite features of Sass, and you can combine nesting with using this ampersand to stand in for the parent selector, which in our case is the header class name. So this way we don't have to write out header every single time for these child class selectors, and it just makes things a lot more efficient, especially if you end up changing the block name for whatever reason in the future. All right, so that's a quick look at how I format my Sass styles in my projects. Like I said before, you are free to use this project as a boilerplate for yourself, and you can build off of it for your own coding projects. Everything I have linked down below. Also, if you like this tutorial and you want to learn more Sass in depth, check out my course, Responsive Design for Beginners, where I show you how to build a website from scratch from a Figma design, just like how you would if you were a professional web developer. That is linked below also. All right, so thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.